The 540 is brought to you by StarCityGames.com's weekly sale. Head on over to StarCityGames.com/sale because starting today until Sunday, October 3rd at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time, you can get 10% back in bonus bucks site-wide for every dollar you spend. That is right, bonus bucks are back. Every time that you spend $1, 10% back in-store credit directly to your account. We all know that Magic sets come out every 3 or 4 days, so you can shop now, get the best new Innistrad Midnight Hunt cards for your Cube, or your Commander deck, or your Modern deck, or your Standard deck now, and you can save that 10% for when Innistrad Crimson Vow comes out in just a few weeks. I'm sure it's right around the corner, no matter when you listen to this podcast. 10% back in bonus bucks site-wide now until Sunday, October 3rd at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time. Go over to StarCityGames.com/sale. The 540 is also brought to you by Coalesce Apparel and Design. If you want to get the coolest Magic t-shirts and hoodies and stickers, go to coalesceapparel.shop. And if you find something you like, use gift code SCG to save 10% off at checkout. That's coalesceapparel.shop. Nobody made what they wanted, so they made it themselves.
What's up, everybody? Cedric Phillips here, stopping by real quick to let you know about one of Star City Games' newest podcasts, The Receivables, hosted by yours truly, alongside my partner in crime, of course, Patrick Sullivan, where the two of us discuss Magic sets, both past and present, from top to bottom. On every episode of The Receivables, you're going to hear us talk about the facts of a set, the mechanics of a set, the cycles of a set, you know, the boring stuff, before we get into some crazy stories of when we were playing Magic during the times that the set was legal. We've got a ridiculous award show where we give out awards like the Char Rumbler Award for weirdest card in a set, the Oko Thief of Crowns Award for best card in the set, and a whole bunch more, before we finally decide, hey, what card won the set and what letter grade should we give the set? It's a whole lot of fun. We're having a blast recording them. Hopefully you have the opportunity to listen to it and you enjoy it as much as we're enjoying recording them. Where can you find it? StarCityGames.com or wherever else you listen to your podcast. The Receivables every single week here at SCG.
Welcome back, one and all, to the third and final portion of our Innistrad Midnight Hunt Cube review for the 540. We're finally here. It's been 3 long weeks, probably 6 to 7 long hours. We appreciate you sticking with us the whole time. I'm Justin Parnell. You can find me at jparnell1 on Twitter. Of course, my co-host, ever so patient.
I am Ryan Overturf. You can find me at Ryan Overdrive on Twitter. And we do it for the love of the game. And for me specifically, the love of Innistrad. I do adore this set. There are a lot of cards to talk about and a lot more to go today as well.
Yes. Yeah. Just because we're 2/3 of the way doesn't mean we're actually 2/3 of the way. We're probably a little bit less than.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There are many cards. We obviously have basically the rest, which is green, and then the smattering of lands, artifacts, multicolored, etc. talk about today. And there's a lot going on in both of those sections as well, but I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, we've already done white, blue, black, red, a couple sections to go. You said before we started recording, we want to maybe see if there's anything we want to revisit, and you have a card that you've gone up on appreciation for quite a bit.
I have. So the first week, so 2 weeks ago, we talked about white and blue cards, and this was the first time. It was actually very shortly after this card was revealed. And maybe if I had had more time to think about it, I would have argued a little more strongly for it. But that's Malevolent Hermit. And this is a 2/1 human wizard for 1 and a blue. You could pay a blue, sacrifice it, counter target non-creature spell, and let's control it, plays 3. And then it has Disturb for 2 and a blue. It turns into a Windrake on the back with the Disturb clause. If it would die, you exile it instead. It also says your creature spells cannot be countered. So this is a much more powerful card, in my opinion, that I think I gave it credit for initially. And I would personally move it up to what we would give it as a classic designation. And I think that it probably fits in just about every cube. It's so rare that this is going to be blank against a deck. Because even in an aggressive deck, you get to block twice with one card. It's like a bad blue Kitchen Finks, but blue Kitchen Finks would be probably the most obnoxious card of all time. So it's
yeah, 2-power blocker is actually kind of a removal spell. Mm-hmm. And specifically when you're talking about a blue control deck, if you're not going into black, red, white, I guess if you're a mono blue or a blue green deck that needs to survive early creature onslaught, just something that's good at blocking goes a long way.
Yeah.
And then this also has either that sort of super spell pierce mode or the backside in blue mirrors. I've actually been playing a bit of standard on Arena. Todd Anderson tweeted a pretty cool Is It deck that had one Malevolent Turban in the sideboard. After playing against the card, I upped that number to 4.
Jesus.
Because it's not just the front side, like the backside, making it so your Alrund's Epiphanies are uncounterable is just like a huge deal in standard.
Oh my gosh.
And also, like, you have to kind of get through the front side either by having it counter a spell or kill it, because it will just counter your spell. So there's like a lot going on with that card as it pertains to standard. But then in cube, I think it just does enough to clear the bar against realistically whatever your opponent is doing. Maybe you pay a little bit too much if you're on blocking duty, if you run into 3 toughness creatures, whatever. But all the same, it's going to be one of your better cards in some matchups as well, which I think that, bumping that up to classic makes some sense to me.
Yeah. I think it's really powerful. And we both liked it, I think, when we first talked about it. I think that it was probably undersold. So I'm happy to change my opinion on that after some more time in the tank.
Yeah.
Did you have any other? Go ahead.
It was one that I was already planning on playing with, but maybe underhyped it for the general audience.
Yeah.
And then the other card.
I was going to ask if you had any other ones.
Yeah. So playing that Is It deck that Todd tweeted out. I think he should have an article upcoming on SCG this week. Maybe it's already out by the time you're hearing this, but it had 4 main deck Smoldering Eggs. And that was the one for 1 in a red, 0/4 defender. When you've cast total 7 mana of instants and sorceries, you transform it into a 4/4 flying dragon that whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, it deals 2 damage to any target. That card, just with the general play patterns, the kind of deck that would play it, I don't think it's that difficult to transform it. I actually think that the card is very good, whereas initial assessment, we did put it in classic, or in custom rather. I do still think it's a custom card because that is kind of a lot of spells to be casting. Blocking is not what you got to get up to. There's better win conditions for blue and red decks that care about these sort of things. But I do think this is actually a strong consideration and is actually going to be one of the better cards in a blue and red spells matter theme for a more custom power level cube.
Yeah, I really liked, this is a card that I really liked last week, but felt like it was right on the other side of being, something every single cube would want. And I still feel like that, because if you're not supporting, if for some reason you're just not supporting like a spells oriented like blue red archetype in your cube, then this is probably going to be a miss for you. But yeah, I do think that is a pretty widely accepted thing and is going to make it into a ton of cubes.
If it was like full prowess, if it counted artifacts and planeswalkers, it'd be a home run.
Oh God! Well, then it would be slam dunk.
Yeah,
then it would, if it counted non-creatures, you could make an argument this is the most cubable card in the entire set.
Yeah, it would be a very serious upgrade. As is, still very nice if you're into instant sorceries matters. You do need some more expensive ones. You won't necessarily get there on just cheap cantrips and that sort of thing, but I think it is actually very powerful and very cool if you do care about those things.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think it's a sweet card. All right, well, we got a lot to get to today. We have, I think, more cards we're going to be talking today than any other week prior. So we're going to take our first break, and we'll be back to talk about green in just one moment.
Listen up, gamers. I have some huge news. If you haven't heard, the SCG Tour Online is back, and we're giving away cash prizes, tens of thousands of MTG Arena gems, MTG Arena Qualifier Weekend invitations, MTG Arena Championship invitations, and the big one, Star City Games Invitational invitations. You heard that right, the Invitational is back, and that's going to be at SCGCon. SCGCon is back, taking place Halloween weekend. That's October 29th through the 31st in the Star City. That's Roanoke, Virginia. And you can qualify for the Star City Games Invitational via the SCG Tour Online. Stay tuned for more details on that. Those will be coming soon. And for more information on the SCG Tour Online, head over to scgtouronline.starcitygames.com. Now back to the pod.
All right, Innistrad Midnight Hunt green cards. And green is a really, really interesting, it's an interesting spot for me because I think that the good cards in green are very good, and I think that it might be the shallowest color for cube also.
Yeah.
In this set.
It has more classic cards than we saw in black, but I think black was deeper and added a little bit more to some of the custom themes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of what you have here is is a number of pretty powerful cards, but they're all pretty straightforward. And the ones that are in custom, there's not quite as many. So Ryan, I'll let you get started because I know the first card we have is a card you are quite fond of.
Yeah, and I expect this to be one of the more anticipated cube cards of the set, and that's going to be Augur of Autumn. 1 green for a 2/3 human druid. You may look at the top card of your library anytime. You don't reveal it. Courser of Krufix did reveal it, so a little change there, but you may play lands from the top of your library. So there's your Courser reference. And it has Coven. As long as you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, you may cast creature spells from the top of your library. This is just cookie cutter, a card that I want to put in my Vintage and Legacy Cube mono green decks, because I'm already looking to play a bunch of Mana Dorks, Noble Hierarch, Llanowar Elves, Sylvan Caryatid, Devoted Druid, and with some of those 0 power Mana Elves, with some of those 1 power Mana Elves, and then this is a 2 power creature. You have some other different power and toughnesses you can get up to. Certainly as you start casting things like Garruk Wildspeaker, making that 3/3 beast, or getting to any other 4 and 5 mana plays, you'll get some 3 or greater power creature that will get you to that Coven. So at that point, you're able to play the lands and the creatures off the top of your deck, which is going to let you really overwhelm your opponent if it's a matchup that's all about just doing your thing quickly, whether you're racing a combo or it's some kind of just battlefield go wide mirror. This will enable you to go wider than your opponent. Something that happens to me with some regularity in the Magic Online queues is I draft a sweet Gaia's Cradle deck, and then I get to play the sweet Gaia's Cradle mirror in the league queues. So this would be a great card for that sort of thing. That's going to come up less often in your queues at home, but all the same, it's still a card you'll happily put in those decks.
So this card has a couple of things going for it for me. One, I don't know, Ryan, if you've ever tried to cube with the card Vizier of the Menagerie.
Yes, the 4 mana 3/4.
Yes, lets you play creatures from the top of your deck. You can take a little peek-see similar to this card. Yeah, I've tried that one, and I'm sure as you did, found it wanting.
Mm-hmm. It kind of turns out that like playing the lands off the top is just way more valuable.
Yeah. So I made the comment as I was like cutting it for my cube, like I was literally like unsleeving it and putting another card in. And my friend asked, he was like, "What was wrong with this card?" And I was like, "Well, it wasn't Oracle of Moldiah."
Yeah.
So ironically, now it is, except it's 3 mana, and you get the Oracle part first, and then of course later. And this is the order you want it in. I think this card would be. I would feel very differently about this card if you flipped the 2 abilities where you could play creatures, then with Coven you could play lands. But that's not the case. So,
and if that sounds strange to anybody, just to shine some light on that, when there's lands on top of your deck, the ability to clear those so that you can draw gas is super important. If you have 1 or 2 castable spells in your hand, it doesn't help you that much to cast spells off the top of your deck. What you want to do is make sure that you continue to draw spells, and an ability that can clear those lands is exactly what's going to facilitate that kind of churn where you can keep casting spells every turn. So the casting the extra spells is nice when everything's already working, but you don't need cards for when everything's already working.
Yeah. The second factor of this card, which I think might not be immediately evident to a lot of people, green is in a really interesting spot in most cubes, to where for Coven, it's incredibly easy to get a 0 power creature. It's incredibly easy to get a 1 power creature. And it's incredibly easy to get a huge creature of 4 or more power. There's not a huge amount of creatures that have 2 power that are generally 2 power creatures. There are a few, but a lot of the creatures are like Scavenging Ooze, and like the other ones are like Courser and Oracle of Moldiah, Eternal Witness, Acidic Slime, Reclamation Sage, and I think that's just about it for the commonly played cards. Everything else does not have 2 power. So in green, you're actually going to have an easier time activating this Coven ability in most cubes, because this is actually filling a power slot that is less frequent per rate across your creatures than most other colors. So this is statistically should turn on more frequently than it would if you just took, all of the creature cards in your cube and you average their power. Greens, because of its ramping nature and its reliance on mana creatures, kind of generally skips the part where you kind of hit the 2 power creatures.
Definitely.
So yeah, so that's actually something I was looking at actually while I was a couple minutes late, is because I was literally going through my cube list and I was like, yeah, and I looked through a couple other ones and I was like, yep. So that is just a very interesting point for this card.
Yeah, that's a good point. If anybody was concerned about the ability to turn on Coven, you probably will be able to. And if your list isn't already there for some reason, it won't be that difficult to make those tweaks, because those cards do exist and they are really heavily played. So you'll be able to find out what they are.
Definitely.
And this card's compared to Courser or Crewfix a lot. And the thing about it is you're just going to cube with both.
Yeah. Yeah. They're both quite good.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're both quite good. Now, I was talking about the lack of 2 power creatures, but we have another one in our classic section that I actually think is an incredibly powerful card. It's actually like for some reason, when I read this card the first time a week or so ago, or a couple of weeks ago, probably, I didn't even remember this card existing, but as I was going through today, I was like, oh, this card's a powerhouse. This is Outland Liberator. This is a 2/2 human werewolf for 1 and a green, and it has the ability pay 1, sacrifice Outland Liberator, destroy target artifact or enchantment. So that's going to put it basically on par with Reclamation Sage right off the bat. Then it, of course, is a werewolf, so it has Daybound. This is the day side. And when it goes to nighttime, it turns into Frenzied Trap Breaker. It becomes a 3/3 and just a werewolf, and it still has the same ability. You can sacrifice it, pay 1, and destroy an artifact or enchantment, but it also has the ability, whenever it attacks, destroy target artifact and enchantment depending player controls. So I actually think that this is a perfectly reasonable cube card with on the front side. I don't think it pushes it into like this is absolutely excellent territory on the front, but this is like a totally fine cube card. If you would cube with Reclamation Sage, this is something that theoretically you would cube with, even though it doesn't have these same creature types. This is a human instead of an elf. But other than that, it's functionally a similar card, even though you obviously have to sacrifice it, but to get the ability. But the fact that you can flip this over, turn it into a larger creature, and then just attack and trigger that ability makes this incredibly powerful.
What's the green creature from Darksteel? You pay 1 and a green to naturalize. You sack it to naturalize. It was a rare.
Viridian Zealot.
Yeah, we've come a long way from Viridian Zealot. And I mentioned
that was in my first cube.
I was going to say that card used that card saw standard play. That card was in a lot of cubes. Yeah, and these designs are just so much better. I mentioned when we talked about Cathar Commando that I believe that there are 2 cards that are just upgrades to Casale Prime Mage in this set. Outland Liberator, going to be the green version of that. And yeah, the only downside to this card is it does read a little bit like a sideboard card. It's not something you necessarily want in your green ramp deck, which tends to be a lot of the classically powerful green cards, but it's still a cheap creature. It still shows up as a body for your Gaia's Cradle and whatnot, can defend for your Planeswalkers, and in the high-powered cubes, there tends to be a lot of powerful artifacts and enchantments, so it's not like it's a total miss to just main deck this card. And if there's a lot more of that, if you're getting into signets, then there's plenty of reason to main deck the card. So yeah, I do like the card quite a lot. I do think it's a bit worse than Cathar Commando because Commando is a little bit more on plan for the white decks, but that's not the comparison you're making. You know, this can fit into a lot of green columns.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think it actually scales well as the creature side gets less powerful, the artifact and enchantment killing side gets more powerful inversely to that as you get higher powered cubes. So I think this is definitely a win on both sides.
Yeah, I'm into it. Our next is the last of the Adversary Mythic Rare cycle, and the only one that costs 3 mana as a baseline.
No. Yes, it is. You're right.
It's Primal Adversary, 2 and a green for a 4/3 wolf with trample. When Primal Adversary enters the battlefield, you may pay 1 and a green any number of times. When you pay this cost 1 or more times, put that many +1/+1 counters on Primal Adversary. Then up to that many target lands you control become 3/3 wolf creature tokens, or not tokens, just creatures, with haste that are still lands. So 3 mana, 4/3 trample, that's serviceable. A little bit of a fail case here. You're probably going to be looking to pay the extra cost more often than not with this one because green is the ramp color. So then things get interesting at 5, 6, and 7 mana, really, and even just up from there. Because for 5, you pay 1 and a green once, and you have a 3/3 tapped land. It doesn't untap the land, but you still get 2 bodies, and you have the 5/4 then, as opposed to the 4/3. And then if you play it for 6, then that does mean that the land is freed up to attack right away, which can be a big deal if there's planeswalkers on the battlefield, or also just because you also just cast a 5/4 with trample, you can really start getting aggressive at this point. And then at 7, you get to make 2 lands, and then it just kind of scales that way. So it's not doing exactly what I want to be doing in my Vintage and Legacy Cube green decks, unlike Augur of Autumn, but it clears the bar. And it's a good payoff that can come in early. In particular, if your opponent's trying to bully you with planeswalkers, it's really nice to have a cheap, large trampler in your deck.
Yeah. I will say that I think this card is quite good, but this card also bores me to death. Like, I just for some reason not into it. When I look at this, it looks like a more powerful version of a card that I love way more than this card. Which is Rude Awakening. And I haven't cubed with Rude Awakening in many years. Time has kind of passed that card by. The people that have cubed for a long time have either died to or killed people with Rude Awakening many times in cube. Right? I'm sure you fit into that category.
Oh yeah.
And Primal Adversary is on rate. Look, I can't deny that it's powerful. It's bringing a lot of literal power, like points of power, for a singular card for not a lot of mana. But that's not ever enough for me for cube. Like, it needs to do something either consistently or in a way that synergizes with something else, and Primal Adversary doesn't. I have no doubt this card is powerful. I also have no doubt that I'm not going to put it in my cube or even test it because I don't think there's anything else I'm going to learn about.
Yeah, that's reasonable. I don't think this card's really going to surprise anybody. And I think for a really high power level cube, you're probably only looking at it for a 540 or more card cube. And actually, my favorite thing about this card is pertaining to custom applications. I'm always looking for more ways to make green compelling outside of just being the mana ramp color, because mana ramp is broken and it's really difficult to balance correctly and make interesting games that revolve around mana ramp. Apologies to David McDarby.
He knows what he did.
But I really like that Primal Adversary is a huge upgrade for cubes that are trying to make the green 1-drop Experiment 1. And the other Experiment 1 that I'm forgetting the name of, the Pellet Collector, that's the one. If you're trying to make those cards more what your green deck is about, and cheap threats that can get large, and making green kind of this beat down, mid-range, just beefy color, I think Primal Adversary adds a lot to those strategies, and that's where I am most interested in the card.
I absolutely agree with you. And I would say that maybe as a whole, from a full cube design standpoint, that it's more interesting because it plays a role to further develop that archetype rather than the card in its isolation.
Yep. Yeah, I'm definitely less thrilled about just putting this card in some green deck.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, like, look, if there's a cube where like Call the Herd is good, this is going to be a sweet card because you're just trying to. All right, Call the Herd sucks.
No, now I was going to say, now you got me nostalgic.
Yeah. But cards that are just gigantic green beaters, which I think is, I actually do like. I think that is more interesting inherently than Ramp is. Now, speaking of giant green beaters, we have one coming up next, and this is I would say this is another pretty good slam dunk card for green for cube, and that's Tovolar's Huntmaster. This is a 6/6 human werewolf for 4 green. And it says when Tovolar's Huntmaster enters the battlefield, create 2/2 green wolf creature tokens. And of course, this is the day-bound side as it is a werewolf. So the night-bound side turns into Tovolar's Pack Leader. It's a 7/7. And it says whenever Tovolar's Pack Leader enters the battlefield or attacks, create 2/2 green wolf creature tokens. And it also has the ability, which I forgot about until I'm reading it right now because my evaluation of this card is irrelevant of this, but it also has 2 green, another target wolf or werewolf you control fights target creature you don't control. So we have said a couple of times, and I think we say this every once in a while, this is a Grave Titan for XYZ cube. Well, this is a Grave Titan for your cube, regardless of what cube you have, because this is just green Grave Titan.
Yeah, and unless your Primeval Titans are finding Field of the Dead or Merit Lage combo, I think this is a convincing upgrade from that. I previously been
don't even think it's close.
Yeah, I've previously been on the Vorinclex train myself, but I can see an argument for one or either or both of these over Primeval Titan in most cubes. It does irritate me a little bit how close this is to Grave Titan. And it's because I think that this is correct in green. Like, I like Grave Titan, and it makes more sense as the ability is green. So this is kind of Grave Titan Erasure, which doesn't sit great with me. But all the same, this card is awesome. I had it in a booster draft deck last week. All of my opponents lost before I could get it online, which was deeply upsetting.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
It's going to be a bigger deal in Cube.
Yeah. Yeah, where there's actually like some meaningful counterplay across most decks. Yeah, this is like I said, we've joked about other things being Grave Titan. Tovolar's Huntmaster is actual factual Grave Titan. This is like a super duper easy slam dunk for basically every single cube in existence. Unless you don't have green cards in your cube, I guess probably don't want to. It's
nothing
not worth
wrong with
including
that.
Yeah. If you don't have green cards, you're not going to want to include this. If you do, I think you will. I just looked my 540 card cube. The only 6 that I have is Vorinclex, but I will be adding this as a second, most likely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Right. Now we have the literal end of the alphabet, so you can probably conclude that this is our last classic green card. It's Ren and Seven. 3 green for a legendary Ren Planeswalker. It starts on 5 loyalty. +1 can reveal the top 4 cards of your library. Put all land cards revealed this way into your hand and the rest to your graveyard, so you cast Mulch. 0, put any number of land cards from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. -3, create a green Trifo creature token with Reach. Remember that. I've attacked into that with flyers, so it has Reach.
And they're big.
And this creature's power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control. And then -8, the ultimate, return all permanent cards from your graveyard to your hand. You get an emblem with you have no maximum hand size. So this is part of a rare class of planeswalkers that have 4 total loyalty abilities. And the starting loyalty is actually very high. This card is just seeing a ton of standard play. Big combo there. The -3 Tree Folk. And then immediately attacking with a Seeker's Chariot allows you to copy that Tree Folk and really kind of go off and amass a huge presence on the battlefield. The Seeker's Chariot, also a really popular and powerful cube card these days. So you can expect to see that curve and lose to that curve in cube.
Yeah, it's always fun to throw in things that are a beating in standard into cube as well.
Yeah. And this is on the fair side of being a beating in standard. Like you don't feel cheated when that sort of thing happens to you. It's really good, and you won't have a lot of time to figure things out. But there's all like kind of fine stuff happening. I think a Seeker's Chariot actually quite a bit more powerful than Ren and Seven.
Yeah, in general. I mean, objectively it is. I think it fits across more archetypes. I think that this is a classically powerful cube card because one, the loyalty is so high, so the likelihood you're going to get 2 gigantic Tree Folk or better out of this is pretty reasonable, a pretty reasonable assumption. Unless you're playing the most unique cube, most cubes and limited decks are pretty land heavy. So while Mulch in isolation, I don't think is great in the average cube, although I definitely think that Mulch is good in some cubes. This is on a planeswalker, and anytime you can do a repeatable spell on a planeswalker, that generally proves to be pretty powerful. The rest of the cards going into your graveyard, I think, is really great for graveyard having strategies, because you can again do this repeatedly, and you're always going to get a bunch of lands to essentially do whatever you want. The 0 ability, I think, is the most situational, because it's going to be, you really have to be putting a handful of lands onto the battlefield. Like 1 or 2 is generally not going to do it, because if you're going to be doing 1 or 2, you're probably going to want to be +1 or -3 either way. But the fact that this can make a gigantic Tree Folk, and as you've said, like the fact that it has basically any other ability and Reach is a pretty notable one. It's such a good defensive ability to protect Ren to make another Tree Folk in a couple of turns.
Yeah, the only real point against the card, and it is compelling to me for Legacy and Vintage Cube, is the space for 5 mana green cards is very crowded, and many of the other options can do a little bit more on the battlefield. I'm really partial to Vivian Reed, in particular when it comes to Legacy and Vintage Cube. Immediately firing off that Naturalize or destroying a flying creature is very significant. The Tree Folk is of some value. I think that Ren and Seven isn't quite there compared to other green 5s for the highest power cubes for me, but I'm not going to be terribly upset about it like I am when I see Vivian's Monsters Advocate in a Legacy or Vintage Cube, which I think is comparatively horrible.
Yeah, and I think that I really hate Nissa Who Shakes the World, and I think that that's a miserable cube card.
I love Nissa Who Shakes the World.
Oh my god, it's such a terrible play experience.
Not if you're casting it.
It's a terrible play experience when you're casting it, but you do win the game. I'll give you that. I just think that Ren and Seven is significantly more interesting. I do like Vivian Reed. I think Vivian Reed's utility is highly undervalued as far as like planeswalkers go in general, not just green planeswalkers. It's honestly like one of the most flexible planeswalkers. And there's definitely decks where if you're just like minus plus or so it starts with 4, so minus plus plus minus is a very difficult thing to beat as you're destroying something meaningful and drawing a couple cards.
And if things are just like even on the battlefield, plussing Vivian is horrifying.
Yeah, because you can't beat the ultimate. If it ults you, we'll lose.
You also just like can't beat it drawing 2, 5, or 6 drops.
Yeah. Vivian's great, but again, I still think that Ren is a very interesting card, and a powerful enough one that I would personally put it in classic.
I think it's powerful custom for me, but I'm not offended by the classic designation.
Okay. Well, look, we each have one. That's how I felt about Primal Adversary. I'll take it on Ren as well.
Deal.
Okay. All right. What do we have next? This is our first custom card, by the way. So it's custom all the rest of the way for green. This is Briarbridge Tracker. This is 2 and a green for a 2/3 human scout. It has vigilance when it enters the battlefield, investigates, you make a clue. And as long as you control a token, Briarbridge Tracker gets +2/+0. So I think this is supposed to be like a fixed tireless tracker. I do think the vigilance is nice, and it's probably more meaningful than it looks, because this is going to be a 4/3 creature that eventually draws you a card at some point later in the game. And I think that's nice. This is not even in the neighborhood of being the same card as Tireless Tracker, which is obviously the card that it's trying to somewhat emulate, as Tireless Tracker has arguably the greatest landfall ability for any card in any cube ever. But I digress. Briarbridge Tracker is a fine card, but it does not reach the utility or the power level to be classic.
Yeah, completely agree. The average case, if you're assuming no other synergies, and when you factor in the fact that this card doesn't have any scalability, you just cast it and you have a 4/3 until you crack your clue, then you have a 2/3 an extra card in your hand, right? So that's fine. And I've played with and against this card in just Midnight Hunt booster draft, and it's better than a common or an uncommon in most cases.
Yeah,
it's 2 for 1. That body is fine. But I think if you're not really caring about human, or it also matters if you can just generate tokens otherwise, and this is always a 4/3 even if you sack your clue, it's totally reasonable. It's not on the level of other stuff that you would put in a mana ramp deck. It's more likely going to be showing up in a green deck that's trying to scale back the power level some, which I do see the appeal of. Love that it's a human. It's just it's kind of a middling card.
I think a lot of green 3s in cube are really like where you get more interesting and like archetype specific designs, and it's competing with all of those, and it's so just overwhelmingly generic that I actually think it's going to have trouble breaking into cubes, even if people like it. But they're going to go and they're going to look at their green section, and it's going to be like, well, now what do I cut for this? And I think that's going to be a really difficult thing for this card to overcome.
Yeah, and it technically is a nice card for a blink theme, but it's nowhere near the level of Eternal Witness and probably a few other green creatures you can rattle off there. So I like the card, but I don't expect it to be in a ton of cubes.
Yeah, that's basically how I feel. I think it's just this is gonna be one of those cards that kind of just gets crunched out and forgotten. But so be it.
Yeah,
I'm not gonna
keep that in mind when you put together the game objects tribal cube. Though we get our clue token.
It's actually not even the optimal 3-drop. It's still the 6th best one.
Yeah, it's gonna fall behind Tireless Provisioner there.
Yeah, exactly.
And plenty of others.
Yeah, Tireless Provisioner, it falls behind Chatterfang. It's just, I'm serious. There's just, anyway. What do we have next?
Next we have Burly Breaker, 3 green for a 6/5 human werewolf. That is huge.
Baby. It is huge.
Ward 1 and day bound, so it becomes day if it was neither night nor day. And then when it is night bound, it becomes an 8/7 Dire Strain Demolisher with Ward 3. I do have to, I get a little taken aback when I do see this card in booster packs when I'm drafting. 5 mana 6/5 is gigantic.
Yeah, it's It's seismically huge.
And Ward 1 comes up against the kind of removal you have to muster to defeat a 6/5.
Not only that, but this is... You're speaking of booster drafts specifically. I don't know how much you drafted Kaldheim, but there was a card called Grizzled Outrider that was a 5/5 for 5. That was it. It was just vanilla 5/5 for 5, and it was like a very good common.
Oh yeah.
This thing is just a absolute... I mean, Burly Breaker. Yeah, when it's breaking your back, because that's exactly what's going to happen. There is exactly one place for this card. And that is a common uncommon cube. And if you are interested in a giant green creature, this is a relatively cheap one for its size. And Ward is going to make it very frustrating to play against in a good way, because Ward is still better than Hexproof.
Yeah.
So,
and it's subsidizing just a thick creature. Like Burly Breaker isn't going to be a bad play experience in games where it lives. It's going to be a bad play experience potentially in games when it dies. Yeah, spending 5 mana for a creature and having it die right away kind of sucks. But
yeah, but it's still just 5.
Yeah, but like the play experience you want is like 5 mana, 6/5 lives, and that is worth pursuing.
Yeah, this is a huge thing. I mean, I think it outclasses just about everything else. Obviously really hates death touch creatures, and there's way more of those in common uncommon cubes, but what are you going to do? Anyway, yeah, Burly Breaker. It's pretty straightforward, but I think that it definitely has a place.
For sure.
Okay, the next card. Oh my gosh. Well, let me tell you, look, I got to lean in. The text is so small on this one. Consuming Blob. This is an ooze. It is a star/star +1. So the old Tarmogoyf treatment. And as you will find out, similar to Tarmogoyf in a way, consuming Blob, its power is equal to the number of card types among cards in your graveyard, and its toughness is equal to that number +1. Why not? Never mind. I'm just going to keep reading. At the beginning of your instep, create a green ooze creature token with this creature's power is equal to the number of card types among cards in your graveyard, and its toughness is equal to that number +1. The reason, I'll just say it outright, the reason this card could never be classic for me is the text is too small. It's got too many words. Just figure out a way to make this smaller, and I might be more interested.
How could you possibly read that?
I legitimately had to lean in. Look, I know I'm not young anymore, but I'm not old enough to have to lean in. The text is, what is this, Strixhaven? With the text this tiny?
Couldn't they put some of that on the backside?
Yeah, they have 2 sides. The whole theme of this year was you get 2 sides on the card. Anyway, yeah, I mean, this is here's the thing. I don't think Tarmogoyf is generally a very good cube card very often.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I have it in my personal 540 card cube because it plays a specific role, but I don't think it's very powerful. Tarmogoyf costs 2 mana. This costs 5.
Uh-huh.
Now, if you untap with, if you can go to your instep and make another one and then untap with it and do it again, you're going to win the game. I mean, that's pretty simple. Is this better than another ooze like Biogenic Ooze?
No.
That cost 5 mana and immediately makes another 2/2, and then you can make more 2/2s? I would say probably definitely not.
Yeah, and you can't avoid the comparison to Tarmogoyf, and unsurprisingly, I like this in the sort of cubes where I actually think Tarmogoyf becomes an actively good card. And that's not the case in the classically powerful cubes, because Tarmogoyf doesn't fit into your mana ramp deck. That's been the indictment of a lot of these green cards as we've gone over them, where this card is not going to be the best 5. This card is going to be weaker than a lot of stuff. If you're racing to have 5 mana on turn 3, it'll still be good because you've made a 5 mana play on turn 3, though it might still be a 0/1. So maybe it won't actually be good. But anyway, I like Tarmogoyf, and by extension, I see an argument for consuming Blob. If your cube is heavily graveyard themed, and specifically if you are supporting Delirium, I think that This can sit there nicely with your Ishkana Graph Widow, and actually is just much larger. So the removal that's going to show up is going to be less effective against it, and it'll close games quickly that way. It's not even a home run for those cubes. There's a lot of really good fives already, but all the same, I'm kind of into the blob.
Yeah.
I will say, in the cubes that we were talking about earlier that are less rampy and more punchy for green, Tarmogoyf is still not great because you have to rely on your opponent to make it good. And consuming blob only says your graveyard. So there's a really good chance in those cubes it's going to be a 1/2 because you're going to have a creature in your graveyard or 4 creatures in your graveyard.
Yeah, and that's a big reason I call out Delirium support. I think you are looking at the list for Mishra's Bauble and Seal of Fire and maybe like Vessel of Nascency.
Yeah, I completely agree. So look, I'll put it this way. I think if you have a cube that consuming blob is good in, then I would like to draft your cube because I think that would be a fun experience. I just think that this is not going to make the cut in a lot of queues because it's just going to get powered out by other things.
Yep, definitely a valid concern there. Next up is a card that I think actually goes in very similar cubes to Consuming Blob, but the burden is much lower because it's a 1 mana card.
Yes.
This is Deathbonnet Sprout. For 1 green, you get a 1/1 fungus with tiny little hands. At the beginning of your upkeep, mill a card. Then, if there are 3 or more creature cards in your graveyard, transform Deathbonnet Sprout into the 3/3 Deathbonnet Hulk, a fungus horror. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may exile a card from a graveyard. If a creature card was exiled this way, put a +1/+1 counter on Deathbonnet Hulk. So, just kind of going off of a self-sustained engine in your deck, gives you a churn of cards. Maybe you are looking to hit Threshold, Delirium, just flip over anything that cares about the graveyard, which there's a myriad of things in the history of Magic. And then when it transforms, that means you necessarily had 3 creatures in your own graveyard going in, so this can start growing by exiling your own graveyard. But it's also kind of a slow piece of graveyard hate because you do just exile a card from a graveyard. Doesn't have to be a creature, doesn't have to be your graveyard. So this can be kind of that weak graveyard hate effect that I advocated for when we did last week's podcast. That's kind of nice to have in a graveyard environment. And it's also just a solid proactive threat that builds you towards the things that graveyard decks care about. So I'm a pretty big Deathbonnet Sprout fan.
I actually am too. Like, this doesn't make classic for me, but I think this card has a lot going for it. One, the flavor is 10 out of 10. Both the name and the art on both sides. And the fact that a fungus is considered a Hulk when it's a 3/3 is just hilarious to me. But exactly what you were saying, and a continuation from what we were talking about, it's not incidental, but it's more measured graveyard hate. Where it's not scavenging use where you can kind of like, snipe things out of the graveyard, but you have to get to a point, it's either in a turn, beginning of your upkeep, when you attack, etc., to be able to interact with it, which I think is positive because if you have a graveyard centric cube, you still need things that interact with the graveyard for your opponent to make it a good play experience. And I like this card because you can get this down early and then you can fulfill its condition by doing other things rather than doing the thing to fulfill its condition and then you have to play the card afterward, which is the opposite of the consuming blob that we talked about moments ago.
I also think it's very significant that once you meet the condition and transform it, the self-mill stops. There's actually a problem on some existing cards. I'm blanking on the name, but from original Innistrad, 2 and a green, it's a star. Its power and toughness is equal to creatures in your graveyard and its trample. And at the beginning of your upkeep, you mill 2.
Splinter Fright.
Yeah, Splinter Fright. That sounds right.
Yeah, you're like, I don't want to mill anymore.
And it gets to a point where like you just can't close the game if you have to mill every turn, and your opponent will just play to that outcome, and that's pretty deflating. And then Deathbonnet Sprout does that sort of thing a lot better.
I don't like cards that are force a mill because it turns off like the majority of the other good cards in Magic, which are like card advantage based cards. So you're like, it puts you in a bad tension where you're like, can I afford to play this? I'm having to do math like 3 turns in a row. If I draw a card now, am I going to lose a turn, etc. And this is, I think, just a better design.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Next card up. Ooh, Dryad's Revival. So this is a sorcery for 2 and a green. I'm just looking at the art on this card. This is pretty dope art too. It has Ren and 7 on it. Anyway, sorcery for 2 and a green. Return target card from your graveyard to your hand, and it has flashback of 4 and a green. We've been very recently gifted Balaged Recovery, which is a really sweet regrowth. But this is also pretty sweet regrowth because it's regrowth with flashback.
Mm-hmm.
And even though 3 is generally a lot for that effect, because we're used to getting things like Eternal Witness and even like Timeless Witness for a lot of cubes recently, I think custom power level is pretty much perfect spot for this card. There's definitely going to be a number of cubes that are going to be interested in this. And I do like that it's only a single green on both the casting cost and the flashback.
Yeah, definitely. And 2 and a green, 4 and a green, definitely expensive for the classically powerful cubes. But if your cube is doing a self-mill kind of thing, in particular, I think if you're doing the Innistrad plain cube, or a cube that, for whatever the motivation is emulating some of the Innistrad draft archetypes and talking about Burning Vengeance, some from this set, that'd be Ominous Roost, a card that plays out of your graveyard and therefore pays off those cards, that can also be used to recur those cards, even if you do accidentally mill both because it has flashback, plays in a very significant way for those archetypes.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, this is I would imagine if you have a cube that has, that archetype extended, especially if it's extending into multiple colors, this is probably a pretty important card for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see it being a huge deal.
Yeah. All right. Another card that I actually think is a really great archetype specific card is Eccentric Farmer. This is a 2/3 peasant human for 2 and a green, and says whenever Eccentric Farmer enters the battlefield, mill 3 cards, then you may return a land card from your graveyard to your hand. So this is essentially a 2/3, puts a couple cards in your graveyard and draws you a land. This one is pretty, I feel like utility is pretty obvious. If you are a lower powered cube that cares about doing graveyard centric stuff, this is a nice one. Especially if you are one that has another, like a land sub-theme, which often goes with the graveyard oriented stuff, of course, with Life from the Loam and like Ramunap Excavator, things that where you want to play cards out of the graveyard. This is another nice one. And it's also just a reasonable card for like a lower power level cube, because look, drawing a card is drawing a card, whether you draw out of a graveyard, from your deck, from your another creature, it doesn't matter. That's still card advantage, and that's always important for lower powered level cubes.
Yeah, if you definitely get the land, this card's excellent, and not that hard to generate those situations, be it self-mill. Otherwise, sometimes you roll the dice, but even like Terramorphic Expanse gets you there. So card is very good if it does get you the land.
Yeah, for sure.
Next is Hound Tamer, 2 and a green for a 3/3 human werewolf with trample and daybound. And an activated ability, 3 and a green, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. And then when it becomes nighttime, it transforms into the 4/4 Untamed Pup, which still has trample, can still pay 4 to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. And then also says other wolves and werewolves you control have trample. It's just a solid size 3 mana 3/3 trample, especially the trample combined with an ability, however inefficient it may be, to modify power and toughness in combat. If you're playing something like a peasant cube that does involve a lot of creature combat, that's a huge deal. I've been very pleased with this card in Midnight Hunt Limited, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, like, I'm not too good for Nessian Courser. I've seen some people on Twitter claiming they're too good for Nessian Courser, and they're spoiled. Hound Tamer is excellent for these kinds of environments.
Yeah, you can be too good for Scathe Zombies. I don't think you can be too good for Nessian Courser. if you take yourself seriously and limited. Okay, a 3/3 for 3. Look, everything I was talking about Grizzled Outcast. A 3/3 for 3, a 4/4 for 4, 5/5 for 5. Those are generally good limited cards. Okay, this has Trample on it. It turned into a 4/4 on the Nightbound side, which is, I mean, that's great, sure, but yeah, I like having a solid beater with a relevant ability. Obviously, this is only for lower powered cubes. I kind of wish this was a common for cube, but not a common anywhere else, like not for limited, not for regular limited, because I think that this is a great breakthrough card for those cubes, because that is you often in pauper cubes that just have commons, you often are in stalemate situations, and a card like this helps break that open. So yeah, I like Hound Tamer. Next up, this is another card that some people have been trying to make work in Standard. Storm the Festival. There's a lot of pips on here, so you know how we feel about that. This is a sorcery for 3 green, green, green. Look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may put up to 2 permanent cards with mana value 5 or less from among them onto the battlefield. Put the rest in the bottom of your library in a random order, and it has flashback of 7 green, green, green. 1, that's a lot of green. 2, the goal is for you to cast this and hit Esika's Chariot and Ren and Seven. And then your opponent will emoji you a couple of times and then concede. I think is the goal. I mean, this is a high power but slow card. The flashback to me is like, it's slightly irrelevant, but look, if you are still wanting to do the ramp thing in green in a lower powered cube, getting to 10 mana is definitely possible. I wish that when you flashed it back, it changed the mana value that you would be able to get.
I was going to make that point because there's the blue rare, the draw spell.
Yeah,
I'm trying to find the name. Memory Deluge.
Memory Deluge.
Where it counts the amount of mana that you put into it. And it's really bizarre to me. And I always assume that this card does it. And it's really bizarre that it does not track that sort of thing. 5 looks, dumping in 6 mana, having to be so heavily green. You know, if you hit the right things, it's worth it. But I think this card is asking a lot and rewarding you with variance and upside that you could realistically find with most any other 6 mana spell.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's important to think about when you're considering to add this in your cube that the fail case is going to be a couple of lands, and that's not terrible.
Yeah, it's interesting that the getting lands gets you closer to flashing it back, but it also meant that you took your 6 mana turn off and are probably getting punched in the face by something.
Yeah, it's tough. This is just a tough one. Like, the power level is there. I think my issue with it is you're playing limited, and even though you're playing higher power limited in cube, this is kind of working against the nature of how traditional deck building goes. With, you know, if we're looking at a regular limited deck with 23 spells, 17 lands, and you are having to really focus on curve to be a participant in the game. And this card plays much better in constructed when you can, 1, have more copies in your deck, and be a little more focused on the type of specific things you're trying to hit. And it doesn't quite translate as well to being in a higher powered limited.
Definitely. Then our last green card in the custom section, Willow Geist. 1 mana for a 1/1 Treefolk Spirit with Trample. Whenever 1 or more cards leave your graveyard, put a +1/+1 counter on Willow Geist. When Willow Geist dies, you gain life equal to its power. So yet another combo for the Flame Jab fans keeping track at home, because putting a spell on the stack from the graveyard does mean that it leaves your graveyard. So a bunch of small interactions like that. If you have flashback, delve cards, it's a little bit of work to start actually adding counters. It won't necessarily be worth it for a lot of environments. You're kind of in this weird spot where this card cares about attacking and blocking, but isn't really good at that until you start doing this other thing. So it's like fine. But then it's a 1-mana spirit. There's a mechanic in here that involves spirits playing out of the graveyard with Disturb. So that's kind of charming, but it's really out of the ordinary for what you would usually see in a cube.
Yeah, I actually think that Willow Geist on its own is a great card. Just period. However, I don't think Willow Geist is going to be a successful cube card, but it's not its fault. It's because it is incredibly difficult to build something in a traditional cube setting that plays to this card's strengths to make it function on a regular basis. Singleton nature really, really hurts Willow Geist a lot because you have to scrape together cards that are literally doing the very specific thing Willow Geist wants. You don't need to do it too many times before this card starts to be meaningful. Like if you get it to a 3/3, I think you're in pretty good shape. But like, what steps did you have to take to draft those cards to build your deck around that? You only have one Willow Geist in your deck. So that's really tough. This is one to file away and then look back in 5 years when we have way more support.
Yep, I'd be happy to see it. It's a big ask.
Yep, that's how I feel. Okay, Ryan, any other cards in green? I think we covered almost literally every single cubable green card.
Yeah, we went pretty deep on green. There's some other stuff that's okay, but we have a ton of gold cards to talk about this week, so I think we should get to that.
Yeah, no question. We're going to take one more ad break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about so many multicolored cards for Innistrad Midnight Hunt. All right, let's see. You went last. That means I go first. All right. Well, Ryan, I get to start us off with our overwhelming list of classic cards for multicolored and Innistrad Midnight Hunt. So I'm going to start off with Sacred Fire. Sacred Fire is an instant for a red and a white. It has flashback of 4 red-white, and it simply says Sacred Fire deals 2 damage to any target, and you gain 2 life. Now, this is not a Lightning Helix. Okay, I know 2 is smaller than 3, and I will also point out that look, Lightning Bolt's a great card. Shock is perfectly fine, and sometimes getting the effect, which is the gaining the 2 life and dealing 2 damage, even though that's worse than doing it for 3, it's still pretty good. But flashback is the thing I obviously like a lot about this card. I've wanted to play the card from the original Modern Horizons that's 3 and a black that does I cannot remember the name of the card for life. It's 3 and a black and it has the same text.
Smiting Helix.
Yes, and it has a flashback for a red and a white.
That card had a short-lived run in the Magic Online Vintage and/or Legacy Cube. It made a quick exit because it's not up to par.
Yeah, it's a really cool design, and I really wanted it to work. But it's also 3 colors, and it's just
and it costs
weird.
more up front. I think where Sacred Fire is appealing is that for red and a white, it theoretically kills a lot of the creatures you care about. And that's going to be an important thing to ask. And I'm going to say it, it might ruffle some feathers, but Lightning Helix doesn't end up in a lot of good aggressive decks. Part of the problem is just being Boros is worse than being mono red or mono white a lot of the time. Another part of the problem is 2 mana for a burn spell for 3 damage is only okay, and you don't care about the life gain. So you're going to bench it even if you can cast it in a lot of better versions of the Boros deck anyway. So the idea for Lightning Helix is usually to end up in a red-white axe, maybe Jeskai, maybe Mardu, I don't know. But a deck that's trying to use it as a Doomblade kind of effect, maybe pad its life total. And if you're playing a cube where Sacred Fire, where 2 damage is very meaningful against many of the cubes, 1, 2, hopefully 3 mana creatures, it's actually a big deal if you start hitting 3 mana creatures, then I think this card is quite solid for the red-white X control decks.
I will take it a step further. I think that Sacred that Sacred Fire, unless you have the card Snapcaster Mage, which I'm sure some of you have heard of, I think that Sacred Fire is a better control card than Lightning Helix is.
I think that is broadly true. There's a little bit of meta stuff you get into, how many specifically 3 toughness creatures and
of course
planeswalkers are really coming up and dying. But there's going to be a lot of games against aggressive decks where you meaningfully get the 2-for-1 on Sacred Fire.
Now, I will say, I do think that while I think Ryan and I both agree that this is a fits into the classic designation for us, it's not like this is not a slam dunk classic card. But I think this is going to make it into a huge amount of cubes, and it is unlikely to disappoint people.
Mm-hmm.
You can look at this card and evaluate it pretty easily once you have the question answer that Ryan asked about how many creatures at what mana cost does this kill. But you probably know that because this is most likely not the first burn card you're putting.
It would be really weird if that was the case.
It would be it's like, oh my god, I only have a Lightning Helix cube. Only Lightning Helixes. I got Lightning Helix and War Leader's Helix, but now I got to look at 2s. I'm used to only hitting 3s and 4s. So yeah, Sacred Fire, pretty sweet. I also really like the art.
So this is the point of the podcast where if you have a gold artifact or land card you really like from the set and think is very powerful, to grab the torch and pitchforks, because it is time for the custom cards.
Yeah, we have extinguished the Sacred Fire and all of the classic cards that was in.
As I was working on my custom list, I just was baffled at how long it was and how strongly I felt that none of the cards were classically powerful. But anyway, our first custom card in the rest is going to be Arcane Infusion, blue and a red for an instant. Look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal an instant or a sorcery card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Flashback for 3 blue and a red. So 4 looks is a lot. And some people get really defensive about cards that don't always find you a card, because they're really content with good enough and missing sometimes. For me, I don't even love Impulse, because I feel like 2 mana is sometimes a lot to spend on a guaranteed looking 4 cards. So Arcane Infusion for me is going to be largely for something like a Peasant Cube or just a lower power level cube that has a heavy instant and sorcery theme. And I think that we're looking for a cube that really is playing those instants and sorceries that make the star, like play those cards that make the token for the number of instants and sorceries in your graveyard, that are really all in on instants and sorceries. Because if you're not doing that, this card is not convincingly more powerful than Think Twice.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think one, thank God this is, if this was a sorcery, I would not have it on this list. just straight away. I don't have time for this shit as a sorcery. Get out of here. But fortunately, it's 2021. It is an instant. Yeah, I the only thing I will disagree with Ryan is I actually don't think this is good in a Peasant Cube, because I think the saturation of creatures as opposed to instants and sorceries is much higher. So I would say this fits pretty squarely into a lower powered cube that is very instant and sorcery heavy, where you're not restricted by rarity and you can end the game in non-creature ways a lot of the time.
Yeah,
and that's
agree.
pretty rare.
I would not go into just like general Peasant Cubes. You do have to be focused for sure.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, that's really my only other comment about this card. Otherwise, I agree with Ryan. Okay, so we went back and forth because we have a lot of cards to talk about for multicolored, and we outlined a couple of cards that we both tried to like make a tiny argument for, of like maybe this could be classic, and then no one felt strongly enough to move it, which is how we ended up with Sacred Fire as the only one. But I did say if I was forced to pick a second, which I'm not, which is why this is still custom, is Arlinn, the Pack's Hope. Arlinn is, in my opinion, a very interesting card. It's a legendary planeswalker, of course. 4 loyalty, you cast it 2 red and green, which is notable because there are a decent handful of other cards with that casting cost. And the reason that, as we'll talk about, that Arlinn may or may not make the cut is more due to competition than the text on the card itself. Anyway, Arlinn starts off as Daybound. So, of course, like all of the werewolf things, it has a Nightbound side, but the Daybound side, it has +1 until your next turn. You may cast creature spells as though they had flash, and each creature you control enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter. So I'd like to note, this says each creature you control enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter, not when you cast the creature. So if you plus and then you make 4 tokens, they all get +1/+1 counters.
Yeah,
that
another potential card for persist combos.
Yeah, and a pretty good. Solid ability. You know, this is something that we've seen on other planeswalkers, but it's always you can play them with flash, not here's another extra bonus, and it's a plus, so that's nice. Then it has -3, create 2 2/2 green wolf creature tokens. So Arlinn starts with 4 loyalty, goes down to 1 if you do that. That's only 2 abilities on the day side. On the Nightbound side, turns into Arlinn the Moon's Fury, +2, add a red and a green. Okay, so let's go adding loyalty. And the only other ability is a 0. And I guess Arlinn gets this now because Gideon's gone. Anyway, until end of turn, Arlinn the Moon's Fury becomes a 5/5 werewolf creature with trample, indestructible, and haste. Let me tell you, that is a hell of a group of keywords. Gideon generally gets indestructible. It does not get trample, and it sure as shit doesn't get haste. So if you have other werewolves in your cube, or you can flip it into night, and you can immediately play this and 0 Arlinn and attack for 5, you're gonna be in pretty good shape. So Ryan,
yeah.
how do you feel about this card? I was a little warmer on Arlinn than you.
So I like what you just said about playing it with other Nightbound things. That, of course, is an argument for a custom environment. When it comes to the classic power level, the numbers are just off, and the value is just not there. Where on the front side, we're talking about a classic cube. We haven't really mentioned that many Daybound, Nightbound cards that are going to be present. So you can generally assume this is going to be one of very few, perhaps the only Daybound, Nightbound card of your deck. So you're going to play it's going to be daytime. You get Arlinn the Pax Hope. You either -3, get 2 2/2s, which is okay. Then you have a 1 toughness Planeswalker left over. That's good for a Planeswalker that continues to be a relevant game piece. The problem is the +1 is contingent on you having cards left over. Otherwise, it doesn't actually give you any materials. It doesn't generate card advantage or produce anything. It just makes the materials you already have slightly better. And it's cool because the plus gives all your creatures flash. You can still use all your mana. You can transform Arlinn. You get to the other side. But even then, when you're transforming it, it takes you some work to get back and then make the 2/2s again, or take a turn off and cast your stuff with flash. It's just kind of tough to do exactly what you want to do on a given turn with Arlinn, and there's just not guaranteed value beyond those 2 2/2s, which there's a lot of other 4 mana cards which can guarantee you that and more.
I'm not gonna lie, that was a good argument.
Thank you.
Yeah. The credit where credit is due. I don't really have too much of a retort. And I guess I'll go on to add that the cards that Arlinn is battling against is Bloodbraid Elf, Huntmaster of the Fells, even something like Xenagos, the Reveler, at that 2 red-green spot. I don't know how many spots you have for those cards in your cube, but it makes it tough for Arlinn to break in.
Mm-hmm. I do like the card, but yeah, it's going to be a custom for me. Just like Bladestitch Scab. This one's at least a pretty quick conversation. Blue and a black for a 2/3 zombie soldier. Other zombies you control get +1/+0. So as you can imagine, this is going to be support for zombie tribal. And there's like a little bit of blue zombies and there's just not much going on for 1 and 2 mana blue creatures. You do get a lot of gold cards. So this being a 2-drop that is a Lord is pretty significant for trying to support specifically blue-black. Nice curve filler. You'll know if you want it.
Yep. Yeah, I don't have anything to add for that. Okay, next up. This is sure to be a crowd pleaser. Croaking Counterpart. This is a sorcery for 2 green-blue. Create a token that's a copy of target non-frog creature, except it's a 1/1 green frog, and it has flashback of 3 green. So this is like a little cackling counterpart. Obviously lower on the power level. You can target any creature, not just your own, which is nice. You only get a 1/1, but fortunately in cubes, as we have noted, and as you probably know, dear listener, that a lot of cards come equipped with enter the battlefield abilities, and you usually don't care a super amount about how large or small they are. So being able to have that with flashback, I think it's a nice thing if you are trying to do something more interesting with your blue and green section in a lower powered cube, and that's probably where I would look at this.
Yep, Sam. I love this card, and I will say that the pool of interesting and cubable Simic cards is pretty shallow as far as 2-color pair goes. There's a lot of
notable on
trash historically, and there's a number of power level extreme powerful outliers recently. So getting an interesting and kind of fun looking Simic card is exciting.
Yep, definitely.
And next we have Denic Pious Apprentice, 1 and a blue, or white and a blue rather, for a 2/3 human soldier with lifelink. It says cards and graveyards can't be the target of spells or abilities. And then has Disturbed for 2 white blue. When you disturb Denic, you get Denic Pious Apparition, which is a 3/2 flying spirit soldier. Whenever 1 or more cards are put into graveyards from anywhere, investigate. And that can only trigger once a turn. Sorry, Justin. And
yeah, I hate it.
That it has a typical ability for these spirits. If it will be put into a graveyard from anywhere, you exile it instead. The disturb drawback, as it were. I think the stats on this card are just totally reasonable.
Yeah, I agree.
If your cube is about combat, a 2/3 with lifelink for 2, and especially given that this will be another creature later on, and you have some other text that can matter. Maybe you care about it, maybe you don't. But I think just if a 2 mana 2/3 with lifelink is reasonable on your cube, especially with that disturb kind of extra card tacked onto it, which again I think is true for just a good number of cubes, this is where you want to put your blue-white deck. It's also a human. This is a nice one for spooky cube for me. So there's at least one.
Yeah, I actually, honestly, even though I do hate that line, I hate the once a turn. I just despise it. I actually think this card's pretty good. A 2/3 for 3 is probably closer to the unfun side than it is the fun side. Because if you're playing an aggressive deck and you're like, all right, I'll play this 2-drop, you're not going to be playing something. You're not going to be playing a 3/3. You're probably going to be playing a 3/2 or a 3/1. So having something that can like trade, or heaven forbid you played a 2/2 and this can block it and gain life, and you get to cold the aggro deck for like 2 turns, that's a very frustrating play experience for them. But either way, it's obviously not too powerful.
Right.
I really like the other side, even though it does have the once a turn. The fact that this is something you're casting from the graveyard, it's not even really costing you a card to do it, makes it totally fine.
Mm-hmm.
It also doesn't limit it to your turn. It's just like it triggers once every turn, but it's anytime it happens. So your turn, your opponent's turn. So over a turn cycle, you can still get 2. And it's not like you'd be able to like utilize a million clues with this card, only because it's difficult. It's a little bit difficult to set up because 1, you have to get it into your graveyard. 2, you have to cast it and have it live before any of that stuff happens. So I don't mind it as much on this. And I think the components of this card, both the front side and the back side, while they are wildly different, are both pretty reasonable on their own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not game breaking. It's not this huge effect, but you don't pay very much and you get what you pay for.
Yeah. I can just say for sure that I will not be putting this into my cube because I do not want any of my aggressive decks to have to play against a 2/3 for 2 with life.
Fair enough.
Just straight away. All right, next card we have, also a blue and white card, is Devoted Graphkeeper. This is a 2/1 for blue and a white. It does not have lifelink. I'd like to note that. When it enters the battlefield, it's a human peasant, by the way. When it enters the battlefield, you mill 2 cards. Whenever you cast a spell from your graveyard, tap target creature you don't control. And this also has Disturb, 1 white and blue for the Disturb cost, and it turns into Departed Soulkeeper, which is a 3/1 spirit with flying that can only block creatures with flying. Well, good news. That's a pretty good rate for a 3/1 flyer, especially when it's not costing you a card because it's coming directly out of your graveyard. So this card is kind of a little bit of a beating.
Mm-hmm.
I actually really like this for common uncommon cubes. I think this card is awesome for those cubes.
Yeah,
and
also,
I think
blue and white as a color pair was really lacking in stuff that cares about the graveyard.
Yeah, and this is a really good. It's not the only good one in this set actually for that, but I think that this one actually has a lot of legs for cubes even beyond that because exactly what you said, Ryan.
Yeah, I played a game of Booster Draft where my opponent played Devoted Graphkeeper on turn 2 and milled 2 creatures with Disturbed, and I was what you would
You're
describe
like, oh,
as mad as hell. But
yeah.
it did excite me about the prospect for the card in cube anyway.
Yeah, I really like, I mean, I think green and white, and or not green and white, blue and white. Sorry, I was going to say something I normally say about green and white. Blue and white, I think, sometimes has trouble finding an identity that's not control or overcosted blink. And look, I try to do the blink thing too, but I just want to be honest with everybody. And I like the angle of having a graveyard-centric thing. And the fact that you have a meaningful thing on both sides, because if it's on the front side, you can start tapping creatures. And if it's on the back side, then you just have a 3/1 flyer that you didn't cost you a card. So, yeah, I'm actually a really big fan of this card. I wish there were more support, but maybe this is the start of the support, and this is something that will be more easily cubable because it has friends.
Well, if you want more blue and white graveyard support, then may I direct your attention to Faithful Mending?
Oh, wow.
Blue and white for an instant. You gain 2 life, draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards. Flashback for 1 white blue, so sort of an homage to Faithless Looting. It's a gold card, costs 2 mana on the front side. It does cost 3 to flashback, which is the same, and it's an instant. This card has already started to make some serious waves in Modern. You see Arclight Phoenix decks adopting it, and some Esper Reanimator decks as well. And the card definitely just has some real cube power. It's not going to go into the classically powerful blue-white control decks. Doesn't really make sense there because the front side, it is card disadvantage. You are using a card and then looting, breaking even with the rest of it. You flash it back, sure, but that's just a break even. So you're down a card, even if it is really good card selection. So I think generally you are looking for a cube that cares about the graveyard. But once you do, I think this card can really be a home run. And again, blue, white, gold cards was a section that was previously lacking. So really happy to see this one.
Yeah, I think power level is right here for this card. Again, this is similar. Now, a probably better example than we were talking about with Willow Geist. The reason this isn't classic for me is not Faithful Mending's fault. There's minimal support around things in blue and white for Faithful Mending to do its thing successfully, because you need to be doing better than just what it is on its face. Like, it needs to be a part of an engine or a function of your deck where you are trying to put cards in the graveyard. I love that it gains you 2 life. I think that's great. I love that it's an instant. I think that's great. I think, like I said, the power level is there for that card, but you need to have other things, specifically in white. It's less of a concern in blue, where they move cards in and out of the graveyard like on a more regular basis and have more flashback stuff, etc. But white needs to develop a little bit more in this space, and hopefully over this set and the next Innistrad set that's coming in a couple of months. Hopefully we will see that, and maybe we can look back at Faithful Mending and say, well, now this has a better shot and more cubes.
Definitely.
Okay, the next one. I love this card. Flesh Taker. This is a 2/2 human assassin for white and a black. It pictures what can only be assumed as a young child with some cleaver-like tools and I guess a cow mask. By mask, I mean probably hollowed out head that it's wearing on its head. Anyway, whenever you sacrifice another creature, you gain 1 and scry 1. And of course, it allows you to do so by paying 1, sacrifice another creature. Flesh Taker gets +2/+2 until end of turn. This is pretty straightforward if you want this card. If you are playing a more aggressive sacrifice theme in white and black, rather than if you are playing a more defensive or combo-oriented one where you're just trying to sit behind a wall of tokens and get them with Bastion of Remembrance or Zolport Cutthroat or Blood Artist and the like. But I like this card because I like the more aggressive ones where you actually have creatures you specifically want to attack with. And you know what's not on this card, Ryan, that I really love?
Can only be activated once
You're
a turn.
goddamn right. You can activate this as many times as you have creatures and mana. Thank God.
I think that this card, on balance, is a slight downgrade from Cartel Aristocrat. But what I do love about it is that the sacrifice clause is independent from the sacrifice ability. So it's usually the case that a deck that wants to sacrifice creatures is looking to have multiple sacrifice outlets. And it's often going to be the case that drawing multiples, there's a little bit of redundancy. You can't fully take advantage of them. And while Flesh Taker is not necessarily going to be your most powerful, it might be one of your weaker sacrifice outlets, the fact that you still get to gain life and scry is a big deal for the card.
Oh, yeah. I love just that little extra bit on it. I don't know if I agree about Cartel Aristocrat. I think objectively, protection from things is it give protection or indestructible?
It's protection.
Protection. Okay, that's what I thought. Yeah, protection from things is better than getting +2/+2 in most situations.
Right.
Especially in blocking situations where it's almost impossible to attack into that card. It's very frustrating.
I said that Cartel Aristocrat is convincingly better.
Yes, I know.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
I thought you said you didn't agree.
I don't agree.
Oh, okay. Then what's the part you disagree with?
The part I disagree with is I think that it's a much better play experience as a cube owner and designer to have a card that pushes aggression to try to actually put into a game-ending scenario, which Flesh Taker does, which in most cases Cartel Aristocrat doesn't.
I mean, if you want to talk about play experience, that's one thing. I just said that it's a stronger card is all.
Yeah, it's probably stronger. You know what?
I do think, I mean, like, there's a reason you don't see very many free sacrifice outlets anymore. That's a really powerful thing to do for 0 mana. So tacking some mana onto that does make that much more manageable.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. Okay, sure. It might be more powerful, but I'm on Team Flesh Taker.
I'm on Team both, but
no, Team both. Yeah. Playing both sides.
I'm on Team Cop Out. Our next card is Florian Voldaren Scion. 1 black-red for a 3/3 legendary vampire noble with first strike. At the beginning of your post-combat main phase, look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the total amount of life your opponents lost this turn. Exile one of those cards and put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. You may play the exiled card this turn. So that's an ability that gives you a little bit more value when you're already dealing damage, when you're presumably, already doing your thing. Generally means you're ahead. But 3 mana 3/3 first strike means the card is a force even when you were not already ahead. This is a body that can attack into a lot of things and is pretty serviceable as a blocker as well. So if you're trying to enable some kind of bloodthirst theme, Specifically, if you're doing Vampire Tribal, which we see a lot of support of those two things that overlap in this set, and some other stuff historically that can play into that. A lot to like there. And this is also just a really well-sized Rakdos card.
Yeah, that's actually what I like about it the most. First strike on this card makes all the difference in the world. Because you really need something to push the aggression, and not just to tangle in combat, but to disincentivize blocking, because you really want to trigger that bottom ability. And if you're assuming that you're going to be looking at 3 cards, because this is of course a 3-power creature, I mean, I think that's pretty solid. Like, the play patterns of this card is you cast it, if it lives, you immediately go to your attack step and attack. And anything beyond 3 is actually kind of a huge amount of cards, because you're essentially just, you're casting like pretty close to like a dig through time, and just casting one of the cards immediately if you deal any more than 3 damage. Like if you hit for 5, you could look at the top 5 cards you just and can play one of them. And excuse me, it's play, not cast. So you can also hit land with this. Yeah, I actually quite like this card. This is probably pretty high on my list, even though I do agree this is custom. But I think the power level of this card, completely independent of anything else you're doing, as long as you are in an aggressive slanted deck in black and red, I think is going to probably make a decent amount of cubes.
Yeah, I agree.
Has a lot of words on it, not as much as the old consuming blob, but
yeah,
maybe they made consuming blob after they had finished designing all of the if it's day and it turns into night, and it's night turns into day, and they're just like, just fucking put as many words on this one as you possibly can.
They look so wordy. Oh, we can fix that.
Yeah. Okay. Next up, another Is It card that fortunately is an instant. This is Galvanic Iteration. This is an instant for a blue and a red. When you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. And of course, this card would not be good unless it had flashback. Good news, it does, for 1 blue and red. Well, this one is straightforward. If you are interested in having a blue-red section in your cube that cares about copying spells, you probably have some other options. However, the flashback on this probably makes it one of the cheaper options to cast twice. Right? Pretty straightforward.
That tracks. I'm there. Yeah, kind of weaker generally than forking a spell after the fact, because those spells have some applications if a counter war ensues, all that jazz. But this one is nice to have around just to copy your ponders, and then probably the plan is something like Time Warp to really go off.
Yeah. I think there's some slight benefit to this. Because, you know, if you're in a situation where you are casting a spell and you're trying to copy it, if you get into a counter war, sometimes that counter war can end very quickly if they simply just counter the spell that you're copying. And with the front loaded copy, that doesn't happen.
Yeah. I mean, if you are really needing to shove. Yeah, the idea of
if you have Galvanic Iteration, I think you are indeed trying to shove.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's just like there's more argument. It is much safer to do the other thing and copy spells once the counter spell is revealed. But this is a way where if the whole plan is to shove, this one lets you shove twice.
It sure does. It does.
Right, next we have Brian Gottlieb's invitational card. I cannot look at the art without seeing his face. It is Join the Dance. Green and a white for a sorcery. Create 2 1/1 white human creature tokens, then flashback for 3 green white. As a spell, little whatever, but makes 2 tokens, they're humans. I think generally speaking, you are going to be looking for human tribal, but it's a totally reasonable card to support a token theme otherwise. I don't think you're going to see a lot of Celestia spells.
It's totally fine.
Yeah.
I just think it could be 4. I just think it could be 4 to flashback. I just think there's not a good argument against why it has to be 5.
Yeah, I think that this card would be pretty safe to print with flashback for.
Yeah, like I'm thinking about like standard, like what, like was this like you were like, all right, don't make another Lingering Souls, everyone. No problem. We'll make the card way fucking worse.
I gotta figure that limited was the concern with this card. Now, I'm not saying that flashing back for 4 would be game breaking and limited, but I imagine that's what they were balancing around.
I still, even with that in consideration, like there's so much other stuff going on in limited that it is easier. It's easy enough to not feel like if your opponent pays 6 mana and puts 4 1/1s into play that you're going to be just bent over a barrel.
Did you consider that it's a green-white card and therefore must be unappealing?
Actually, that's a good point. If your opponent casts green, white, and 2 in limited to put 4 1/1s into play, you're almost certainly going to win the game. And I don't mean the person that cast Join the Dance. I mean the other person.
Yeah.
I'm supposed to evaluate this card for cube. It's fine. I wish they would just go in, like, make more green and white cubable token cards. I actually want this card to be good in cube, even though I wish it cost 4 to flashback. But there's not, strangely, how does white green not have enough support for any archetype? How is that possible? Magic's been around for 28 years. You don't have one archetype that's just like, yep, that's the default green white. Just put in your cube. You don't have to think about it. No, everyone has to do all this math of like, oh, well, I guess I can try to do this counters thing. Oh, it's pretty dry after these 7 cards. I think these 2 token cards, these are pretty good. And then I'm playing Join the Dance as my third best. But just come on. Just pick something, Wizards.
I think that's actually Berserk, is if they change the flashback just to green-white, it was just green-white to cast, green-white to flashback, that would not be groundbreaking for cube.
No, it wouldn't. It would be like, oh, this is a pretty solid card.
You're like, yo, that's a really nice custom cube card.
Exactly, and it still would be custom. That's the problem. Okay, and we're going on to the next card. I don't have anything to say. I'm just frustrated about great, another green-white card. Catilda, Dawnhart Prime. This is a 1/1 human warlock for green and a white, which sounds undercosted, but I actually think the ability on this one's pretty strong, which of course is protection from werewolves. Now it also has the ability, some would say it's flavor text. Human creatures you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color, add 1 mana of any of this creature's colors. So actually, if you're in human tribal, this is going to be great. And still, it has more text. 4 green, white, tap it, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Wow, look at that. We have a back-to-back card. Oh, let's do the tokens thing. Oh, let's do the +1/+1 counters thing in the same set, almost in the same part of the alphabet.
This card's really good with Join the Dance, Justin.
No, it's not. It looks like that it would be.
I mean, this is what you would be getting up to. It's not really good, but
yeah,
it's the thing you can do.
Is this the thing they were worried about in limited? You got your uncommon and your rare in both the same 2-color combination. Anyway, the second ability, obviously the headliner here. If you are in human tribal in your cube, this is actually, that ability is pretty messed up. To be able to deploy your hand quite quickly. And I really like that it has that second ability. Obviously, protection for werewolves is the flavor text, but it has that second ability to where if you're not able to break through, you can simply just like tap all of your creatures and add a 1/1 counter. And you can do that for a couple of turns until you're ready to take over combat. So this creature is very fragile, but it does have a lot of power if you are doing that tribal theme in your cube.
Yeah, and a number of the humans you would generally end up putting in are just 1 mana cards, maybe 2 1s, often 1 1s, and then this really lets all of them start to matter.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, I like it. It's obviously it's narrow, but
the cards that this, or excuse me, the cubes that this card will go in, this will be an impact card.
Right. And next we have Kessig Naturalist, the Signpost Werewolf uncommon, green and red for a 2/2 human werewolf. Whenever Kessig Naturalist attacks, add red or green. Until end of turn, you don't lose this mana as steps and phases end, and it's daybound. When we're nightbound, we have Lord of the Ulvenwald, a 3/3 werewolf with other wolves and werewolves you control get +1/+1. And then it also has the ability to make a green or red until the end of the turn when it attacks. So not the largest ghoul creature and not the best way to go about a mana creature. You have to attack to get that mana, but you're going to be including this card specifically if you are doing some combination of specifically werewolves or a daybound, nightbound thing. The backside is the prize here.
Yeah. Yeah, this is, if you're doing daybound, nightbound, this is a pretty easy one to include. And if you're doing that, the power level of your cube is probably appropriate to where this is going to be a pretty solid card.
Right.
It has been a long time since I've cubed with Rada from Planeshift.
It's a card I think about sometimes, but it's just not there.
That's how I feel too. Like I wish that it was, but it's not. Now there's been a lot of really solid like 2 and 3 mana, like card advantage or mana advantage pushing creatures in the last couple of years. You have Galia, the Endless Dance. You have the other Rada. I think it's Heart of Keld. It's one of those. Anyway, so this is, the competition is going to be a little tough, but this is like, if you're again doing the daybound nightbound thing, this is probably the one. Okay, next up we have Lisa, Forgotten Archangel, finally making her appearance in an actual Innistrad set rather than just Commander Legends. This is a 4/5 angel for 2 white, black. Many pips. But it does provide you with a 4/5 with flying and lifelink, which is pretty solid. It also has the ability, if a creature an opponent controls would die, exile instead. That's always nice. And whenever another non-token creature you control dies, return that card to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step, which is similar to the Scarab God ability. Now, I actually like this card. I don't think it will make many cubes that I own, just because it's kind of in a weird spot where it's like, you know, I would say in most cases a better Baneslayer Angel just because of the extra text, but it is 2 colors. It's got a lot of pips in there. And it's in a color that if it's going to 5 mana or 6 mana or even 4 mana in some cases, you want some like immediate card advantage or killing something else rather than just playing creature and saying go, even though it does provide some utility. So I'm kind of on the fence about this card, even though I do like it a lot theoretically.
I actually strongly dislike this card. And if it weren't for the fact that the text wasn't of some inherent amount of power, I thought about just leaving it off the list. But I do think it's a card that some people are going to cube with. And it has this problem where I think it's really difficult for it to be appropriately powerful. Where the reason
I agree with
that you want this card is like, well, if your opponent has stuff that they wants to die and go to their graveyard, this hoses them. And if you have stuff you want to sacrifice and come back, it's good for you. And it's also just giant and flying lifelink on its own. So like the reason you like it is because it's good, but it's not so good that it's anywhere near classically powerful. So it's like a card that has the only charm of having a lot of stats and power that is not all that powerful. It's really tough to find a good home for a card like this.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with that. I think when it's powerful, it's going to be game breaking.
Mm-hmm.
So it's probably not going to lead to a lot of great cube experiences. And I honestly don't think that it's also tough to break into to black and white unless you're doing something interesting or dynamic or incredibly efficient, none of which qualify for this card.
Right. Next we have Ludovic Necro-Genius. This card is really wonky and kind of fun. blue and a black, 2/3 human wizard. Whenever Ludovic Necro-Genius enters the battlefield or attacks, mill a card. And then for X, blue, blue, black, black, exile X creature cards from your graveyard, transform Ludovic. X can't be 0. Activate only as a sorcery, and then you get Olag, Ludovic's Hubris, a 4/4 legendary zombie. As this creature transforms into Olag, it becomes a copy of a creature exiled with it. So whatever you exile with that blue, blue, black, black X there, one of those. Except its name is Olag Ludovic's Hubris. It's 4/4, and it's a legendary blue and black zombie in addition to its other colors and types. Pretty number of +1/+1 counters on Olag equal to the number of creature cards exiled with it. So this is like kind of a Scarab God experience if the thing you like about the Scarab God is that it plays out of the graveyard and is otherwise a serviceable body, and you don't like the fact that the card is frustratingly powerful otherwise.
I think there's a pretty big gap in old Ludwig Necro-Genius and the Scarab God.
Yeah, that's what I said.
A
Like,
really big, really big gap.
Yeah, on power level, they're nowhere near each other.
If you're like, so the Scarab God is too powerful, but also Dinrova Horror is too powerful, then maybe I want Ludwig Necro-Genius.
I wouldn't say that this card's weaker than Dinrova Horror. I think being able to cast it on turn 2 is like really closes that conversation.
Sure. I guess I'm pretty cool on this card. The fact that you can only activate this as a sorcery, it's just because it's so expensive to do, and it's like so easy to like see your opponent setting this up, and you have to do like meaningful setup to be able to pull this off, because you have to spend 5 mana. X can't be 0. You're spending 5 mana, including just a million pips. 5 mana. Turn this into a 5/5, because it's going to be at least a 5/5. I don't know. Even in
like
lower power
sometimes I feel like your rebuttal to custom cards is like it completely through a classic lens. Like, I'm imagining this card is going into a cube
bring up
that
the Scarab God.
really
You brought up
cares.
the Scarab
But
God.
I didn't compare them on power level. I compared them in terms of like what you might like about the card. Like, this is a thing that can play about the graveyard. It's kind of Reanimator, but it's attached to a body. Like, it plays on the battlefield more. That's what I was trying to make a comparison for there. You
That's
would not put this in the same cube as the Scarab God.
No.
It mills you a bit. Like, attacking with a 2/3 is a lot easier than a smaller body, which is a pretty solid rate for a 2 mana card.
It is. I'll give you that.
And so I think that this card's going to show up in more graveyard cubes, and it sounds like you would think it would.
I think you are probably right. I do think on the front end, a 2/3 for 2 in blue and black is pretty solid. Like, I actually think that is a good.
Yeah, third point of toughness is like massively important for this card.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like we were talking about with Dinnick. Even though this card doesn't have lifelink, the fact that it's just a 2/3 is actually a pretty big deal.
Mm-hmm.
I think I am warmer on the Ludwig Necro-Genius than I am the method of transforming it into Olag and Olag itself.
Yeah, I think you have to be in for the front side.
You absolutely do. Because I think that the effort to pull off the backside can be quite dangerous, because it takes a single removal spell or 3 damage to basically time walk you, and that's a spot that I don't like to be in. And I think every cube, regardless of power level or rarity, is capable of stopping that with relative ease.
Yeah, your opponent generally will, but you also just don't have to get up to that. And that's why being a 2/3 is so relevant, because it's still like a pretty meaningful blocker, even if you're not able to really fully do the thing.
I think ultimately my issue is I'm not in for this card on just the front side. Like, that wouldn't do it for me on its own. So it's tough for me to evaluate the backside when I think in a realistic scenario that it's going to be non-existent or detrimental to your plan.
Sure. I think that the front side is pretty convincingly there for a spider spawning type archetype.
That's fair. I think that's fair. That's fair. Okay. Next up we have Rim Careless. Is that yeah.
Well, we'll allow it.
Thank you. Stalwart Slayer. First of all, Stalwart Slayer is a pretty dope nickname. This is a 2/3 human knight for 1 red and white and has flying and haste. If a spell would deal damage to you or another permanent you control, prevent that damage, just straight up. Except to Ren, or Rim, excuse me. It doesn't prevent damage to itself. If a spell would deal damage to an opponent or permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage +1. Now, I wish it were source, but obviously this card would be nuts and probably in the classic designation.
I'm pretty happy that it's not source.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. Yeah, I think that would be a pretty poor play experience. But preventing other damage is pretty solid. The only issue with this for cube is that this is a red-white card. You're preventing the damage of the cards that you draft in most cases. Unless there's another like aggressive red deck that also did the spell damage, which I think is rare. However, the bottom half is what I'm way more interested in, and the fact that it has flying and haste. Adding that +1, that's actually a pretty meaningful amount. Going from 3 to 4 on like Incinerates, or if in Ryan's cube, Volcanic Hammers, as we've talked about previously. That's actually a pretty big deal because it's to it's to anything, an opponent, a creature that they control. That's a pretty nice thing.
Yeah, I mean, this card is a very obvious upgrade in many ways over Sky Knight Legionnaire, which is a card that I still find charming, but probably not really in contention for the same cubes. You can do some funky things. Like, I think it's going to be a big deal in a lot of cubes if you have some ability to modify this creature's toughness, because it is still vulnerable to a lot of red removal spells itself. Mm-hmm. So, and it's also kind of a body that's worth hitting with a lightning bolt. So it just kind of says, kill me first, kind of a flag bearer more than a big damage prevention thing. So it does make it so you don't get fully swept up by an Anger of the Gods. But I think that if you're able to have some ability to give this creature a 4th point of toughness, then it does become a really big deal against red decks. And it has some ability to do extra damage with your burn spells. That's not for nothing.
Yeah, I like that's the most intriguing part to me, other than the fact that it's a 3 mana flying haste 2 damage fellow in the air. But yeah, lower powered, but I would not be surprised if this made a lot of cubes. I do think it's interesting that Innistrad lays claim to the best like Legionnaire type creature and the best landfall creature, just stealing directly from Zendikar and Ravnica respectively.
Yeah, they got something for everyone.
Yeah.
Next card is Rite of Harmony. Green and a white for an instant. Whenever a creature or enchantment enters the battlefield under your control this turn, draw a card. Flashback for 2 green and white. Pretty notable that this will draw you cards off of tokens, which is a big difference from Glimpse of Nature. That's the one. It is green and white, so obviously the card is unplayable and disinteresting. But I think that in a cube that's kind of going bigger, especially if you have some kind of ability to produce bodies on layaway, you just cast this for 2, do your other thing, get your tokens, draw your cards. That can be very significant. This is more going to be for a cube. I see this being a player in the cubes that David McDarby designs. I see this and I just think live the dream.
I was complaining earlier about white green going between counters and tokens. I actually think this is a pretty nice tokens card if you are going that route. Because if you cast any spell that gives you tokens, you're immediately going to get generally better than you put in as far as casting of spells. So if you cast this, and even if you cast like a Raise the Alarm, which is like the bare minimum of what you would probably be doing in this, you're still going to draw 2 cards.
Yeah, like join the dance.
Or join the dance. But if you have like a planeswalker that you activate too, if you can put like 3 creatures onto the battlefield with a minimal amount of spells in the same turn, and I'm not saying that it's great, because I still think that this is clearly, if that was something that was very powerful, then this would be classic, because you'd be able to push that archetype in a wider variety of cubes. And again, I just don't think that you can. I don't think the support is fully there. But even still, Rite of Harmony in lower powered cubes, it lets you put together this nice little tokens package where you actually have kind of like a front end payoff. And the fact that it has flashback later in the game means that it's, if you do draw one of those token maker cards where you put, you draw a Spectral Procession later in the game or something like that, you can flash this back, and even though it's going to cost you your whole turn, you're going to draw 3 more cards. And I think I like that portion of this card as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Next up, why they put so many green-white cards in the set? Sigarda, Champion of Light. This is a 4/4 for 1 green, white. It's a legendary creature, angel. It has flying and trample, and it gives human creatures you control +1/+1. And then, of course, it has Coven. When Sigarda attacks, if you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal a human creature card from among them, put them into your hand, put the rest in the bottom of your library in a random. So, a couple of good things about this card. Stats are pretty solid. It's a 4/4 for 4. It is 4, but it's like 3 pips. You know how we feel about that.
Mm-hmm.
Flying and trample. So that's not bad. It is very human-centric. However, the downsides, again, those goddamn pips. And 2, this is something that loves humans, but is not a human. So the human cards will not love it back. Much. I know. The human cards won't love it back, and that's probably the killer for this card.
That is exactly the point I was going to make. Like, This is a card that looks like it would benefit humans tribal, though in all likelihood, I mean, it's a little hard to cast, but if this goes in your cube, it's going to show up in games where you're like, someone just plays it because it's a 4 mana 4/4 flying trample. Like, the humans you control get +1/+1, and the other ability caring about humans aren't really factors for this card's playability.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. This is, I think, going to miss a lot. And I guess I really just wanted to talk about this card because I want people to be wary of it if they're including it in your cube to assist humans tribal. Make sure that this is actually doing what you want it to do, and that another just actual factual human card would not be better in that slot.
Right.
Because I think there's a pretty good chance that it would.
Even though it would have to be a green-white card, there are some that are good for humans, if that's your thing.
Hey, Join the Dance puts 2 humans into play.
Exactly.
I mean, I might just want that more than Sigarda. I probably would. And I would definitely want Catilda Dawnhart Prime more than Sigarda.
Yeah. If you want your games to be about the humans, I think Join the Dance does a much better job of that than Sigarda does.
Yep, full agree.
So our next card is actually, I think there's a really good chance that this is the gold card that ends up in the most cubes, because it has a real big illusion of power thing. This card reads like it's doing something pretty powerful, but it actually does something pretty medium. But it's Siphon Insight. Blue and a black for an instant. Look at the top 2 cards of target opponent's library. Exile one of them face down and put the other on the bottom of that library. You may look at and play the exiled card for as long as it remains exiled, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast that spell. Flashback for 1 blue-black. People are trying this out in standard. It's just, your opponent's deck just doesn't necessarily have spells you want to play with. and it's a very small number of looks. So sometimes you steal their best card and you have a nice chuckle to yourself, and you really get one over on somebody. And that's the appeal of these Gonti-esque things, playing off the opponent's deck really lets you harass your friends. So there's some upside there, I guess. But just not a very powerful card, really. Just is the variance inherent in a small number of looks and your opponent's deck, as opposed to your own, which in theory has some kind of game plan you're trying to execute, where cards that are not cards that are in your deck are less likely to contribute to that game plan.
Yeah, I mean, Brian nailed all the big hits. I think that I'm glad you brought up Gonti, because I actually think Gonti in a lot of cubes is a pretty sweet card, but it's also a much better card than Siphon Insight. Siphon Insight, you look at so few cards at a time. 2 is like nothing.
Mm-hmm.
When you're casting Sleight of Hand on a deck that's not yours. Like,
yeah, Sleight of Hand doesn't even make a lot of cubes, and you can look at your own deck.
You can look at your own deck. Yeah, this is also 2 colors. I understand it has flashback. So at flashback, you are paying 1 blue, blue, black, black, and you are coming up with an extra card. And I'm putting air quotes around that. And then you're still losing the body that Gonti is providing by being a 2/3 Death Touch creature that is also a creature that you can blink and reanimate and all that other good shit that you like to do with creatures.
Mm-hmm.
So if you like doing that stuff, I think Gonti's a fun cube card that is a good novelty to do that actually has utility beyond just the let me take a little peek and steal one of my opponent's cards. That Siphon Insight has literally absolutely 0 of those things.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it has nothing else going for it. And I think this is a card that people were excited about, and I think it's not good.
Yeah, I think it's both worse. I think it's both worse and less good gameplay than Thief of Sanity.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
it's definitely less good. For sure, less good.
Yeah, Thief can for sure just take over a game in a way that Siphon Insight can't. And then it does have the thing where it's a creature, so there's compelling counterplay.
Yeah.
Whereas Siphon Insight, just like, it's miserable if you miss for you, and it's miserable if you really hit for your opponent.
Yeah. Yeah, it's frustrating. You could definitely build a very frustrating blue-black section in your cube if you're like Night Veil Spectre, Thief of Sanity, Ashiok, Nightmare Muse, or Weaver. No, the Muse is good. The Weaver's bad. Anyway, I digress. How about a more interesting card? And that is the card with the tiniest text in the whole set.
You're
I gotta lean in again. Teferi, who slows the sunset. This is of course, legendary Planeswalker Teferi for 2 white and blue. And it starts with 4 loyalty. And I need to again. I clicked it on Wizards website, and it made it. It actually made it smaller, but it did center it on the screen, so that was nice. Okay, choose up to 1 target artifact, up to 1 target creature, and up to 1 target land. Untap the chosen permanents you control. Tap the chosen permanents you don't control. Gain 2 life. -2. Look at the top 3 cards of your library. Put 1 of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. Plays poorly with the other cards we were talking about putting cards in your graveyard as a blue and white card. But how could you possibly remember that? It's only other cards in the same set. -7. You get an emblem with untap all permanents you control during each opponent's untap step, and you draw a card during each opponent's draw step. So, I think that this card is quite sneaky because it tells me that it's a blue-white card, but it really looks a lot like a Bant card. Because to really take advantage of the plus ability, you probably want to untap a creature that you have tapped during your turn that has provided you some sort of utility, such as adding mana. If you were just doing it to give your permanent pseudo vigilance, it's probably not going to be good enough. And there's a lot of other blue and white planeswalkers that bear this name that this is competing with. So I think it's going to be difficult to battle with those. -2 to do an actual factual anticipate, because the cards don't go into your graveyard like the rest of the blue-white cards in the set. I would say it's definitely balanced. I don't know if that is quite good enough out of a planeswalker. I think -2 is actually a lot for that ability, but I guess they're trying to be safe. And it does start with 4 loyalty, so the -7 you can get to in a reasonable amount of time in a cube game, because you can, hopefully, if you've built your deck to take advantage of the +1, provide some sort of defense. But I never evaluate those when I'm looking at planeswalkers. So ultimately, this probably adds up to an underwhelming card for the majority of cubes. However, if you are looking for a blue-white planeswalker that doesn't beat people over the head with how powerful it is, then maybe this is something that you might be more interested in.
Yeah, that's exactly the hole that this card would fill. I made a comparison to some friends that really just seems really incredibly apt and kind of obvious to me. I think this card's very much in the same ballpark as Rail Zarek. Just like, you just look at the numbers and what the abilities do. The overlap is this card almost looks like it was inspired directly by Rail Zarek. So you have like +1 to get some extra mana, or maybe do some other fiddly thing. -2 to try to get a card's worth of value. Teferi doing Anticipate, Rail Zarek doing Incinerate, then like a -7 from starting at 4 loyalty. That probably has a very significant impact on the game. And if your cube's into Rail Zarek, there's a decent chance it's the same cube it's going to be in Teferi, who slows the sunset.
Yep. I will say, flipping 5 coins to take extra turns more fun than untapping all your permanents and drawing a card, but you do you.
All right, our next card is Tovolar, Dire Overlord, 1 red-green for a 3/3 legendary human werewolf. Whenever a wolf or werewolf you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 3 or more wolves or werewolves, it becomes night. So you have an additional condition to change from day to night, and then transform any number of humans and werewolves you control. Tovolar is, of course, daybound, and if we are nightbound, becomes Tovolar the Midnight Scourge, a 4/4 legendary werewolf. With that same text, whenever a wolf or werewolf you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card, as well as a bit of a Kessig Wolf Run callback, X red-green, but it does not tap, to give target wolf or werewolf you control +X/+O and trample until end of turn. This is like the werewolf card. Whether you're talking about this is the legendary werewolf commander, or if you want to do werewolves in cube, I think you'd have a hard time convincing me this isn't the first card you put to support a theme like that.
Yeah, this one's pretty easy because this card is incredibly powerful. If you are doing any sort of daybound, nightbound, or werewolf thing. Or if maybe you're just like you have like interesting tribal synergies in your cube and you just have wolf cards in your cube, this is probably still pretty dope in that too, because it gives the wolves all of those abilities too. And turning everything into Ophidians, all of your creatures, that's pretty solid. And this card is priced to move as well. It's a 3/3 for 3. It turns into a 4/4. So
yeah, even a slightly more powerful card at 4 mana, I think would be a much worse fit, because as we talked about before, there's just so many good things to get up to in Gruul for 4. So a really solid 3 mana Gruul card. Love the execution on this one.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, they pretty much nailed this. I've literally not talked to anyone that was hoping for a good legendary werewolf or werewolf like signpost rare that has been disappointed with this card.
I believe that.
Yeah, it's pretty much nailed everything. Okay, ending up at the very end, only a few more left. Vampire Socialite. This is a 2/2 Vampire Noble for a black and a red. It has Menace. Whenever a Vampire Socialite enters the battlefield, and if an opponent lost life this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on each other vampire you control. As long as an opponent lost life this turn, each other vampire you control enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. This is somewhat similar to the vampire answer to Thalia's Lieutenant. So if you are doing vampire-y tribal things, you simply want Vampire Socialite because it's going to provide a lot of extra power and toughness across your vampires. I don't have much else to add.
Yeah, it's pretty clear where you're going to want this here. And I got to say, it is very important, and I think a great element to the design of this card, just Menace. That keyword really puts this card over because it's actually a pretty meaningful game piece on its own, which, you know, helps it be a good 2-mana card. So I think this is really a really awesome card if you're getting into Rakdos or even Mardu vampires.
Yep. Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, the vampires actually, for a werewolf, more of a focus set. Vampires actually got a couple of really good ones with that card and Florian. So yeah, I
expect we'll be seeing more vampires come Crimson Vow. So
I believe we will.
That's gonna be something to watch. And our next custom card here is Winterthorn Blessing, green and blue for a sorcery. Put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature you control. Tap up to 1 target creature you don't control, and that creature doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. Flashback for 1 green blue. Definitely having flashbacks important here. This card is just pretty solid for just one of those cubes. Likely rarity restricted, definitely lower power level. That's really about combat and just setting up battlefields to make good attacks. Both half of it, just do enough, and then you get all of it, and you get flashback. You ice a thing, it doesn't untap. You grow a little bit. This is definitely going to be a compelling Simic card for that sort of environment.
Yeah, and this is just, you know, cards like this, I always like to take a deeper look at just really good limited cards, like cards in traditional limited. And if you're trying to do the more interesting, a more interesting thing in blue and green, this absolutely makes the cut because being able to do this ability twice is actually pretty backbreaking. But you do have to be pushing a more creature-oriented, you know, kind of a bully deck with your blue and green cards. So if you were doing that, and if you've kind of tried to go away from the heavy ramp or the extremely powerful cards in your Simic section, and you're focusing more on combat and interaction, I think this is actually really good.
Well, I have great news, Justin.
Yes.
You get the honor of reading the most horrible card to read in the entire set.
And I knew that I would. There was never a doubt in my mind that I'd be reading it. We are done with multicolored. However, we're not done with custom cards because we have one more unique card, and that is the Celestis, which is my least favorite text box in all of Innistrad Midnight Hunt. So I'm really glad I get the honor. I don't know if all the words I'll be saying, because I'm going to try to, you know, I'll do my best to just read this. They might not all be in the right order. It won't matter. You'll get the gist. The Celestis. This is a legendary artifact for 3 generic mana. If it's neither day nor night, it becomes day as the Celestis enters the battlefield. You may tap it to add 1 mana of any color. You can pay 3 and tap it. And it says, if it's night, it becomes day. Otherwise, it becomes night. Activate only as a sorcery. And then it also has the ability, whenever day becomes night or night becomes day, gain 1 life. You may draw a card. If you do, discard it. How are you going to figure out this whole day and night ability? And this is what you came up with. And I know they didn't design this card late because this was the whole theme of the set, is about the Celestis.
Right.
Like this deal. So you designed this card first, you put it in the file, and you're like, that is good enough. We don't need to go back and reword that one at all. And I just can't understand that.
We'll clean it up when we figure out the easier way to word day and night. And then that day never came.
Anyway, okay. So let's ignore the larger day and night implications of this card. I imagine if you're doing day-bound, night-bound, this is probably a mana rock that you want just on that, because obviously you can control it. Let's say you don't do that. This has an ability. It's a mana rock for 3 that can add any color. It also has the ability, essentially, pay 3, tap it, gain a life, and then draw a card and discard it. I've seen worse, and I've certainly played with worse in cubes. This does an okay job of fixing your mana because it adds 1 of any color. But it is a semi-useful ability. You can gain a little bit of life, and you are able to loot at the cost of 3 mana. I do like mana rocks, especially in lower powered cubes that have some utility other than just adding mana, because usually they're staying away from the more aggressively costed mana adding artifacts that just add mana. So I think the Celestis, despite my disdain for how this card is worded, I think functionally is more interesting in the context of a cube that is operating at that power.
I play a good amount of Midnight Clock and similar mana rocks in arena cubes, so I expect to play the Celestis. I mean, we'll see if it ends up in the arena cubes. I imagine it will, and I imagine that it'll make my deck a decent clip of the time if it does.
Yeah, I think so too. I think Midnight Clock is actually a pretty good comparison, even though obviously they are kind of on 2 opposite ends of the spectrum for what they do. Midnight Clock is you're building up to 1 gigantic turn. This one is more of a grindy, value-oriented card, but still, yeah, I like Celestis.
Okay, so lastly, we have a cycle. I don't know if we've codified. I've been calling them the slow lands. How do you feel about that?
I think it's appropriate.
Yeah, the opposite of the fast lands. We have deserted beach, haunted ridge, overgrown farmland, rockfall vale, and shipwreck marshal. These are all allied color, 2-color lands. They enter the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more other lands. So your 3rd land drop up, the enter untapped. I thought that maybe I would give this a classic ranking, but there's just so many better options. And then the big thing for me is these lands are especially good for control decks. And there's really not a shortage of lands if that's what you're trying to support. And making sure your lands enter the battlefield on late turns, that's great. But the fact that they are pretty lackluster for aggressive decks, in your 1 or 2 land hands, they're going to really gum up the works. But they're totally in bounds to show up in cube.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for sure. I definitely wouldn't give these a classic designation because it's basically impossible to do so. If there's a set of turns that always happens in any game of cube, it's the first turn and the second turn.
Right.
And these lands are guild gates without the benefit of being gates for the first 2. Now, I understand within the context of the cube, there's only 1 of them, so that's generally only going to come up if these are like your only lands to play, or there's some other like mitigating factors of a land that is actually worse to play than these in your hand. But even still, just on that alone, they're not going to fit in every single. I do think these are going to fit in a huge amount of cubes, but they are a miss for the most powerful ones, just straight away.
Yeah, I don't know if they've announced it, confirmed or denied one way or the other, if we're just going to see the enemy side of this cycle for Crimson Vow, or if this is a cycle they plan on competing. Yeah, that would be my assumption. And then I think that this is a cycle that could for sure be a positive contribution to the arena cubes. And in fact, a number of other cubes. They're quite a bit behind the most powerful lands in 4-cube all time. But again, I'm not going to scoff at them.
Yeah. I really hope they do finish this. I will be a lot warmer on these if I have 10 of them rather than 5.
For sure. Yeah, complete. There's like a few incomplete cycles as of late that would make me a lot happier if they would just finish them.
Yeah. Maybe they'll just reprint the snarls with Innistrad art.
Yeah, they should reprint the snarls and the temples.
Yeah, just both of them. Yeah. Man, it's just unbelievable, the mana. God, the snarls are so bad. I should have even brought them up. Anyway, the slow lands, those are the last cards that we had to talk about. Ryan, is there anything that we missed that you wanted to touch back on?
Oh, miss is strong. Again, there's quite a lot of cards we didn't get to, but we really did end up going really deep. We talked about like most of the multicolored cards in the set.
Literally.
And I think that's a really good thing to highlight about this set and a lot of recent Magic design is they do a really good job, and they have done a really good job lately, generally just making things more efficient, more broadly playable. And for that reason, you do just get a lot of really nice specific cube gems. I think the big standouts to me, the cycle of just the 2 mana tribal cards in this set are all pretty massive contributions for all of the tribes. Well, join the dance, maybe not massive, but it'll go in the humans cubes.
Could have been a contender. Could have been. They even made it like the F&M promo. Like they're like, yeah, check this card out. You guys remember Lingering Souls? If you do, you're gonna hate this card because it's nothing like that card.
You remember Gather the Townsfolk? I do.
Anyway, I don't have any other cards, so if Ryan doesn't, then the only thing we have left to say to you is remember to subscribe to the 540 anywhere that you listen to podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon, Stitcher, YouTube, and your podcast app. Anywhere you can review us, we would absolutely love that, especially after our marathon review of these. I think it's only fair. We give you 3 episodes of review. We just really need 1 from you. I think that's a really fair trade-off. So anywhere you're able to, you just click like the little 5-star button. That's really helpful. Click a little comment that says, nice show. No caps, just all lowercase. That would be a nice comment.
Punctuation.
No punctuation. Yeah. Anyway, we would appreciate that. The algorithm is a hungry beast, and we must feed it whenever we can. You can find me on Twitter at jparnell1, my other podcast, Think Twice MTG, where I talk about magic and pop culture, like movies, music, other games, TV shows, etc. Anywhere you can find this show. And of course, Commander versus the Commander live gameplay that I host over on StarCityGames.com and YouTube. Ryan.
You can find me on Twitter at Ryan Overdrive, and you can find my articles on StarCityGames.com. Last week, I unveiled the Artifact Tubert, which is just one of many designs that I have in my back pocket. Keeping an eye out. I feel like it's going to be any day now. We're going to go back to digital cubes. I do write overviews on all of those as they come out. So whenever we go back to cubing, we might have a lull here with the set releases being so close, which means I'll have more opportunities to unveil my own personal cube designs, maybe talk about some theory on that side of things. But to find out, you'll have to go to the website. You'll have to go to StarCityGames.com. And
I believe, Ryan, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you have written the article about your top 10 cube cards.
I have.
Set. Okay.
Yes. At this point, we have now discussed the full set, so you can go back, check that. You've all played with the sets. Tell me what you think I missed.
I have not. So I never like to look at these articles because I don't want it to influence my opinion one way or the other, either to agree with Ryan or to extra disagree with him. So I will now go back and read this article as well.
That does remind me, I was going to ask you, So now we've done the whole set. What comes to your mind? Do you have an answer for what you think is the most cubable card from the set?
The most cubable card? I mean, the most cubable cards like Consider, right? Like that's the most cubable card. I think my favorite cube card is the Looter Ilkor. The Stowaway.
Suspicious Stowaway.
Suspicious Stowaway. That's my favorite card.
Those are definitely both in my top 10.
Oh yeah, I would imagine. I would be surprised. I would guess that your number one is Consider, but
I have some
maybe
reasons,
you're being cheeky.
I have some reasons that I wrote about. If I told you my number one card was a white card, what would your guess be?
The Adversary.
That's a good guess. That's the correct answer.
Yeah. I mean that card's great. That's we definitely called that one a slam dunk inclusion.
Oh yeah.
So yeah. Was Consider number 2?
It's in the top 3. I think I have Red Adversary as number 2.
Interesting. Okay, I'm gonna go try to go find the article and read it.
Yeah. Everyone's got to find the article. Otherwise, how would you know?
Yeah, exactly. We don't want to give away too many secrets, even though you've given away some. I'm gonna go read it. So thank you all very much for listening. You should go read it too, and we will catch you next time.